Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Luke Freeman.
And I'm Hannah Broderud. And once again, we're recording in my home state of Montana. We're in Bozeman today with a good friend and collaborator, Rachel Hicks. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
Rachel is a graphic designer, event designer, facilitator, and creator of incredible connection in both physical and online spaces. So Rachel, tell us a little bit, first, maybe like, what do you do currently and what's kind of your professional focus these days?
Well, thanks for having me. I would say currently, number one is I'm a new mom.
Yeah.
So that is the most time spent, but
congratulations.
Thank you. Yep. But professionally, I think a lot of my focus now is on events, live and online, that really have purpose, that are driven, have meaning behind them.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time, my background is in design. That's what I was trained in. Mm-hmm. And so that's carried me through all the work I've done. But probably for the last 15 years, I've been, both on the side and full-time event production.
Yeah.
And that's gone from anything from weddings to galas, fundraisers, a lot of work with nonprofits. And now I work a lot with, groups that bring people together for kind of Uber networking, and making a difference in the world. So doing things that change what's happening in our world, legislature, working on getting rid of plastics in the oceans, things like that. And so I spend a lot of my time doing work there. I've realized over the years, and we've kind of talked, purpose is something that is really important in the work you guys do. And I've realized that my purpose in underlying all of the work I've done when I look back and what I want to go forward is that I'm here to use my skills to support others to do what they do best.
Yeah.
And so whether that's in the graphic design realm, if it's producing behind the scenes at an event, if it's on stage, actually asking the questions and getting people to do the work. It's all of those things combined that I just kind of underlie and do and use my skills in whatever place I can to support others.
I love that.
And I find that when other people succeed, then I feel like I've succeeded. It's not me who's curing cancer or doing any of those things, but if I can help that person get one step closer to what they want to do, that's what's important to me. So
that's awesome.
So I'm curious about just kind of your journey to get there, to kind of those words, that clarity that you have. I mean, when did you start consciously, intentionally saying, what is my purpose? Why am I here? And then how has that, have you had different chapters, different iterations?
Definitely there's been different chapters in my life. When I probably became really clear about my purpose was, I would say probably in 2018. Mm-hmm. I had been working for an arts organization, incredible organization called the Archie Bray Foundation for Ceramic Arts, for 11 years. And I left there at the end of 2017. And it was a nonprofit international arts organization, and I did all kinds of things. And the organization grew from 6 employees to 20 when I left, and there's just a lot there. And so when I left, it was where I met my husband. It was where most of my social life was.
And your husband is an incredible artist too, by the way.
Yeah. And so when I kind of decided to leave that job for lots of things, one being I needed to just move to the same town as my husband, right? I had a major crash where I was just what is my purpose? What's my worth? What do I do? Why am I different? I moved to Bozeman full time at that time. And the story kind of goes is I left my job, and then about 3 months later, I I decided to rent an Airbnb in Livingston, which is like 30 miles from here, and lock myself in the basement of this place for like 2 days and just figure it out. Huh. And so that's what I did.
That's pretty intentional.
It was very intentional because I was just at this point. I had also kind of, when I quit my job and I moved here full time, I was like, I'm going to do special events and I'm going to help nonprofits. Mm-hmm. Like, that's what I thought. And I just kept hitting these like barriers where it was like, oh, well, nonprofits really can't pay me what I need to make a living, right? Like if I solely do this for them. And then it was like, I kept hearing like, you need to meet this person, you need to meet this person. And so, and another thing was like, Bozeman was a place for like weddings, right? Destination weddings. And then I decided I didn't want to do weddings anymore. And everyone was like, what are you doing? And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing.
You're in a great place for weddings.
This is where you make money. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that anymore. So I had kind of gone on these like blind dates with people who I'd heard were like doing event production in town. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of just called them up and said, hey, can we go have coffee? And we did. And we talked about, it was kind of like, I heard their pitch. I was like, okay. And so I just kind of sat there and took my notes and thought, okay, well, what makes me different? Mm-hmm. What, like, there's these underlying skills that we all have, but like, what is the difference that I make? And why would someone hire me? And what is it that I can bring? And so that's when I went and locked myself in this Airbnb and kind of went through the whole thing. And at the time I had no desire to be, I didn't know what was going to happen. Right. So basically I defined everything. I like had sticky notes everywhere. Like a big portion of it was like understanding what I didn't want in my life anymore and like what things I needed to let go of. And that was probably one of the hardest things. Like I remember putting a sticky note up on the wall and then being like, nobody can see that, right? Like it was like, I don't want anyone to know that thing, like I'm cutting that thing out of my life. It was so funny. It was like, I think I came home exhausted after those 2 days and like slept again for like 2 days because it was just like, oh. But that started that journey of me really diving deep and understanding like what, like really defining a lot of the things in my life and what I wanted. So like, what does it mean to be a designer? And what does it mean to be an event producer? And what does it mean to be a wife? And what does it mean to be a sister? All of those things. And that's when I started to understand like, where I want to be is like helping other people. Yeah. And yes, like I'm a designer and I can do this amazing graphic design, but it's not like what I want to be doing, like out there making my name doing that. But if like, I know Hannah needs that support and I can help her, then it's like, here's the skill I have. And so that's where that kind of started.
And you, by the way, you have done that for me. Like I've literally experienced that. And it's incredible to have somebody that can just like pull things out of your head and then, partner with you in a way that you can do the thing that you're best at and they take care of the thing that you maybe struggle with or that you have anxiety about and you can just relax and do your thing. Like having that kind of support for any kind of work is incredible.
And I think it's important. I mean, that's part of one of the things I talk about in some of the workshops I teach is, as a creative, as a designer, we like, and you might have the same feeling, like, it's like, I can make anything. Yep. I can recreate or build anything. And then you get to the point where you're like, well, I don't want to, right? But then it's like you have to start to learn how to ask for help for that stuff. And so I try to help. A lot of the work I've done is with young creatives and how they're advancing in their careers and talking about that. So when I see somebody who needs something that I have, I'm like, yes, let me help that, right? Yeah. And so then it's also me saying, okay, maybe I'm not the best at this thing. I need to find someone to help me. So it's like, I can't remember what book it was. At some point I read, and it was talking about like a little bit around that. And something that happens in the art world is we barter and trade
a lot
all the time. Yep. And it finally came like clear to me. It was like, if you want people to pay you, you need to pay people.
Yeah.
So that was another thing that started like changing kind of all of this stuff too, right? Where it was like, oh, I need to like use my skills to support other people. They can pay me, and then I can turn around and pay other people for their skills and the things that they need, instead of always trying to get by and always trying to make it work. And so that's kind of a tangent on what we're talking about. But
no, that's great. And I another tangent or similar tangent. I want to go a level deeper on the nonprofit and then figuring out independent purpose from that, or personal purpose. So similar experience, spent kind of my career number one in nonprofit world. And I'm curious, was part of that transition realizing that you had outsourced kind of your purpose to the mission of the nonprofit you were working with, and saying, okay, well, I'm not a part of that anymore. So like, who am I? What am I about? I don't want to totally project that onto you, but I'm just curious, like,
I think that happens in the nonprofit sector, right? Because it is the people who work there and work there for a long time, right? You do like those values and that purpose, it becomes your life. And that definitely happened. And I think once I could separate myself and like kind of understand my worth and what it was, and like, it's actually been really interesting to like kind of reflect on that and think about some of the stuff. And now for me, I'm getting to a point where I'm starting to realize like, that I am like an intentional community builder. And I wouldn't have really ever thought that. But then when I start to think back on certain things, like that's what I did at the Bright, was build community. My job was, director of administration and a director of communications. But like that was what my like title said, right? But like really I was building community and I was supporting these artists, right? And then if I think back, even recently I've realized like, I started really young in team sports, and then all through college, and then I coached after college. And like that was all about community building and all about intentional connection. Yeah. Like, it was great to win games and do all that stuff, but it was like, when I think back to that time, like, not everybody can say like, I loved high school, but like I had an amazing high school experience because I was part of these amazing teams. Yeah. And that was like, and so when I now think about it, it's like those threads, like when I think back to my time at the Archie Bray, at the nonprofit, it's like at that time I wouldn't have thought, oh, that's what I'm doing, is supporting others to do their best, or I'm an intentional community builder. And now it's like, oh, that's totally what I did that whole time. Yeah. You know, and then as I like looked through other things, and I can even identify like the way that I would help plan and design a wedding. It wasn't just like, it was like, I was all in. That's part of the reason why I had to get out, because I was like, it was really hard. It was like, I'd spent a year with this family, and then it was like, they're gone. And then I'd have to like readjust and be like, oh wait, I have my own relationship that I need to like nurture, right? Like there was just that I just realized that when I do get into something, I really care about all those details and all that part of the community and what it is, and that building that connection. Yeah.
So, to make the connection, I just want listeners to hear, I don't think this is just a nonprofit thing. I know that's kind of how I framed the question, but this idea that oftentimes we outsource what's unique about us to the mission or the purpose of the team that we're on or the organization that we're a part of. And there's this paradox that I hear you kind of talking about, which is the more we differentiate ourselves, the more that we influence the people around us. And so as I get more clarity about what makes me special and what's that unique thing that I have to give, it feels like I'm focusing on myself. It feels like I'm separating myself, but it actually leads to the ability to have much greater impact, much larger ripples, right, with the people that we get to interact with every day. So thank you so much for sharing that.
So I'm curious, Rachel, and I want to pull some more thread on community and how to create intentional community. But before we go there, you mentioned that you're a new mom. So we all go through transitions in life, and I've recently had several conversations with not new moms, but empty nester moms who are like, I don't know who I am. Like my whole purpose in life has been to make sure these children are fed, that they survive and thrive and grow and become good citizens and move into the world. And I finished that work. Like they're they're there, and I have no idea who I am anymore. And so there's, as we go through big life transitions, I think this is one of the reasons it's so important to be clear on what is our purpose that's independent of context. But also our purpose evolves, and that's okay, right? And so how has your purpose evolved or shifted as you've become a new mom and you're not working full-time in a professional capacity? You're spending a lot of your valuable time doing really important work, raising a human, and yet you're also still a professional. So how's that impacted how you view your purpose, or how you live into that?
Honestly, I think my purpose I think I nailed finding out my purpose. Yeah. I spent a long time doing it. I've also taught a lot of workshops around it. So I've done it over and over, right? And so even for me, that was one of the things that when I kind of identified what it was, I realized that it wasn't just tied. And I think this is what is really the thing, is when you realize it's not just tied to your profession. Yeah. My purpose isn't just tied to what I do professionally. It's how do I show up with my husband when he needs something to be his best? And that's, I think, when I kind of started to realize is there's these things that he might ask for that I'm you should figure that out, or ask someone. And then I'm wait a second. My purpose is to help this person be the best that he can be. Yeah. So why am I not doing that with my husband? Right. So I think, it's the same thing with my daughter, right? Is that coming back to my purpose is like you were saying about these other moms, right? Is to give her the ability to be the best that she can be. Yeah. And how do I do that? And sure, I'm learning a ton about that. I've done a lot of work studying around adult development, and now I get to watch a child develop, and I think that's incredible. Yeah. And so it's kind of the same thing as how do I use my skills to help her be the best that she can be, and also get out of her way when she needs me to get out of her way, which is really challenging. I'm only a year and a half in, but I can see how that's challenging. And so, yeah, I think that I just kind of remind myself, it's my purpose is it feels like it's a big umbrella, but that's truly what it is. It can be kind of pushed into any of those. And when I actually reconnect and remember that's what it is, it helps me kind of what you said, right? Be my best self. And that's one of the things I mentioned before we started was I do a lot of work with women. And in our society, right, there's this idea of selfishness if you put yourself first or you do whatever. But I think, as you said, when we're our best self, then everybody else feels that too. Yeah. Right. So it's when I actually remember my purpose is to actually use my skills to make this person do the best that they can, then I can step back and I can get out of my daughter's way, or I can say, okay, you know what, I'm going to put my phone down and I'm going to sit here and play with these blocks because you're learning how to play with blocks right now and you just need me to sit with you. Yeah. And that's what's most important. And so I just have to remind myself to reconnect into that, right? In the times that I get frustrated or I get pushed away or I get so focused on answering my emails or whatever it is. It's what is the true? And I think, honestly, motherhood has helped me do that more than anything else in my life. It's helped me set those boundaries to say this is what's most important. Right. So in my work and in my family and all of those things. Yeah.
Yeah. And the work of being a parent, maybe this is just me. I don't know. I don't think so. But it's so much of a shame exercise. Hey, there's this certain way that you're supposed to do it. And these are all the boxes you're supposed to check. And, there's all these expectations. At least I feel that. But for me, just like in every other area of my life, whether it's facilitating a workshop or coaching someone or creating content or, hey, how are we doing on the podcast today? When I start to doubt, how am I supposed to show up? I have a pretty good habit in these other areas of saying, well, I know my personal purpose is to invite teams and leaders into what's next for them developmentally. And so as a parent, for whatever reason, it took me a little bit longer to really own that. And, I have 3 boys. And so there's all of these thoughts about, you should read this book with them. And, when they turn 13, you should take him in the woods and give him a sword, or whatever it is. And once I was like, okay, that's one way to do it. But my way, my personal purpose is to invite them into what's next for them developmentally, primarily as a facilitator. So that's providing experiences, creating meaning from those experiences, opening their imagination about what could be, providing some continuity to the story that they're living, right? All of those pieces. When I think about it in that light, it was kind of just like a, brain explosion thing. Like, oh my gosh, I can do it the way Luke Freeman is a father.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't really matter how anyone else does it. And yeah, like, what a shame diminishing thing. Definitely a muscle that you have to build. But that just, when I hear your story about becoming a mom and applying your purpose there, like, yeah, it just really resonates.
And I think that's when you do purpose work, right? When we're working with people, and I think especially because often we're doing it in professional settings. And so everybody's in their focus, like, what am I supposed to be doing at work? And so when you can start to break down those barriers and get it to that point where it's like, well, where, if
you're not at work, or if you weren't working at this job, then what would it look like?
Yeah, what would it look like? And I think, I often like to do, like, if I'm going to do work with an organization, I usually have pre-work where it's like, do this like kind of purpose work on your own. So when you show up, you tell me what your purpose is outside of and then we figure out how that actually connects. It's just like values, right? It's like, there's not really a difference between your personal and your professional values. It's just how you show up and practice and the actions, right? So it's kind of the same thing with purpose, where it's like, hopefully you can identify that, and it's more than just where it is professionally. And that's when, like you said, it's like all that stuff goes away and it just makes sense. And you're like, oh, yeah, so much easier to parent, or it's so much easier to show up with your friends or your family or at work when you can just connect to that.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much good stuff here, and there's so many directions I could take this conversation. But let's focus back to community, because that's kind of the focal point, and kind of how, when we first started talking about you coming on the podcast, that really sparked the idea. So we're all very intentionally focused on building community in different ways. And a lot of the leaders on our podcast are intentional, courageous leader who want to impact their communities in different ways, or create community within their organizations, create connection, belonging, all of those things. And we also know from science that actually results in, when we have that kind of culture, results in higher engagement and better outcomes for the organization as a whole. So, over the last 2 years, we've been through some trauma. And when in March of 2020, all of a sudden the world kind of shut down and everybody was forced to go online. And live events were canceled. Whole professions, industries got wiped out. People were, and we're in the aftermath of that surge of isolation and loneliness and disconnect that a lot of people were experiencing on one hand, while others were feeling this overload of, all my family's right on top of me all the time and I can't get anything done. And then we're supposed to try to do the things that we were doing online when we weren't used to that, right? Now, some of us were used to that to some extent. Others, that was a whole new thing, right? If anybody who had invested stock in Zoom before the pandemic, they're, probably millionaires.
Yeah, lucky them.
Right? So a lot of people got to learn about that tool or other, online tools to try to have conversations, meetings, workshops, events online. And we've talked about Zoom fatigue. I've certainly experienced that. I went to a lot of training events and tried to learn as much as I could, right? And I had done some online facilitation already. I'd worked in a large organization that was geographically dispersed, and it was a technology organization. So we had the tools. So like for me, it was something I'd already kind of practiced, but I'd never learned intentionally how to do it, right? And so a lot of times we're thrown into a situation and we kind of fumble our way through, and some people pick it up naturally and just learn how to do it well, while others just really floundered, right? So what I think collectively we've all learned is that technology can be a great tool to create connection, but there's some technique to it. There's definitely intentionality around it, and there are skills that we can learn. And so that's one of the areas, Rachel, where you excel. And I know you've done some both professional training around it and also a lot of practice. And I'm curious, what are, first of all, what does it mean to create connection? And let's talk about virtually now, and let's break that down too, right? We're not talking about a virtual workshop or virtual connection. We're talking about maybe a virtual space, but it's online, and the connection is the connection. And maybe you shared the definition with me of virtual and why I'm not using that word anymore.
Yes. Yeah, I think part of it, like it's easy to say the virtual space and the online space, right? Or versus, and I think when I think of virtual, right, there's simulation that's not real potentially, right? AI,
It's almost,
it's almost,
quite.
It's not completely, but the spaces that I have worked on creating are really like live online.
Yeah.
Right. It's not a webinar. One of the biggest things that I think, that I learned is it's not, you want to talk with people, not at them. And that's the biggest part about building community and connection online. And yeah, we were all pushed into that space really quickly. And like you said, some people were great, some people weren't. Some people didn't want to invest the time either, thinking, well, this is only a couple weeks. And, and then, there's people who spent all their time online too, which man, that would be the Zoom fatigue, right? The exhaustion.
It
right?
was exhausting.
It's exhausting. Yeah. And so I think for me, one of the biggest things that happened was I worked for an organization called Hatch. And it's, always been in-person live summits, these big connectors where we bring people in from all over the world.
And in different places in the world.
Yeah,
too,
and we go to different places in the world to do it. And then all of a sudden it was like, whoa, okay, what do we do? We have this community out there and we need to figure out what to do. Everyone's having a hard time. And so we started what is called the Global Living Room. And so it was just a weekly call where it was opened up. People could come on. It was free. We'd have someone who would speak for a little bit, but a lot of it was just giving space to people to connect and to talk about and sense make, right? Like what is going on, and to hear about people from all over the world. Like, well, what's happening in Germany? What's happening in New York City? Because in Bozeman right now, nobody thinks, whatever. It was so we just kind of created this space that people could come into and start to make sense of what was happening. And so that was one of the first things that we started doing, was just opening. And we didn't know, we just were like, we're opening this room for an hour. Yeah. Come on in, and we'll have musicians, and we'll have, and we kind of developed a lot of that. But a lot of it was basically creating a space for people to be heard, to be seen, and to be felt and share, right? Like we had this really powerful conversation where it was like an ER doctor in New York City in the thick of it, just telling us this is what's happening right now. This is what the decisions I'm making. And all of us going, oh, wow. Okay. That's totally different than me being annoyed that my dog's barking at me during my meeting or whatever, And so that was one of the things that I spent out, we spent hours producing those and just being in holding that space. And at the same time, I was in the middle of, I had started a facilitation training for a type of facilitation called integral facilitation, which is really about self as instrument. So it was identifying what And my intention in that training was like understanding my perspective so that I could open up my awareness to everybody else's, right? So like understanding what my energy and what I was bringing to the room so that I could open that up, allow to see what was actually happening in the space. And so I was starting that training in January of 2020. And then, 3 months later, we weren't able to meet in person. And so that was a cohort of 25 of us, and it was an international cohort. So it was people from around the world, and we were meeting and going, what do we do?
Yeah.
Right? Because so much of the work we did was about space and energy, like what happens in the room and how do you pull out the things that are most valuable and how do you bring in the things that nobody's talking about, right? Like everyone seems happy in here, but we know we're here facilitating because we know there's a problem, but nobody wants to talk about it, right? Like that's what our job was. And then all of a sudden we were pushed into an online space going, how do we do this? Like, I can't feel the energy. And so we started to play every game and do every exercise we could to see like, what could we move online to create the connection that we could do and we knew how to do in person.
Yeah.
And so, we just kind of started experimenting with all the different tools, all the different things. Like, we use Zoom mainly, but there was all of a sudden there's all these things about virtual meetings and rooms that you could go to and have avatars and, mural boards where it's like sticky notes and drawing. And we experimented with everything to see what could happen.
Yeah.
And really a lot of what it came back to was just creating space for people to actually share, and taking that time and actually, opening a room and then saying, how is everyone? And taking the first 10, 15 minutes to check in some way, like using the chat or, having prompts and putting people into small rooms and letting them talk through something. It's a lot of these like leadership tools that you learn or you get trained, it's kind of, that you get, but then all of a sudden it was just putting them into that space because I think there was this energy where it was like, okay, everyone's Zoom fatigued. We don't want to spend more time online than we need to. So everyone tried to do everything really fast. And it was like in and out, in and out. Instead, what I learned is you got to slow down.
Yeah.
And you actually have to take a moment and like say, hey, Luke, how are you doing today? Like, what do you need to drop off? Like, what do you need to say right now? Is your wife in the other room or your kids running around? Like, what do you need to let go of so that you can be present with me for the next 30 minutes? Yeah. Right? Like, how do I draw you into that box? Like, how do we get us all into this box? And knowing that we're all sitting in different space, and be focused and actually and want to be here for the 30, 40, whatever, 2 hours, whatever it is, and then go back. And so it was creating that space to like allow people to be who they were. Yeah. And I think it's the same thing that we should translate into regular meetings, right? Like we should check in and be like, how's everyone doing this morning? Let's go around the room and drop off whatever we need to drop off, right? Before we start. And then another thing that, I found that was really helpful was like being really explicit and like clear on what was going to happen in the time. Yeah. And also saying, this is how I want you to participate in this space. Like, can you agree to be here with me? And if you can't, then like, let's talk about that, right? Like if you are distracted, like, okay, we're going to release you and let you go do your thing, turn off your camera. Yeah. But otherwise I want your camera on and I want you guys to really engage and we're all going to be here for this time together. And so being really explicit about that stuff, like having an agenda to share, making sure that in that agenda, there was time to be like, human about it too, right? Because we were all dealing with crazy whatever was in the space. And so like those are some main things. And then there was exercises that we developed around like kind of bringing in coherence and getting you into that group. Yeah. Right? Like bringing you in. So like grounding exercises or breathing, or there's lots of games we do in person that you can do online too. And it was fun to kind of experiment with those things to get people just to be like totally connected with who's in the room. And you're just there. And I think another thing is like also being really open about the awkwardness of it all. Yeah. like not pretending like we're in person, but like being, hey, we're here.
We're looking at each other at these squares.
Yeah, we're here in boxes, and making fun of that or having fun with it, right? Yeah. Like we even invent games or ask people to show up in certain outfits or, using the space. Like I became very animated in my space because otherwise you're like, someone's just sitting there staring at you.
Yeah. And that's the biggest thing that I've experienced, we're always giving out energy when we're facilitating, when we're live. But the difference is when I'm, at least for me personally, when I'm in a physical room with physical humans that are present in the same real space with me, not, not a virtual room, I also get fed energy back from them, right? There's an energy in the room that I feed on in the conversation, which is why we have chosen to do our podcast in person as much as possible, because the energy of the conversation is a little different, right? When I facilitate online, I feel personally that I'm having to amp up my own energy in a different way so that it translates through the screen and through the technology. And, so I'm maybe a little more animated. I use my voice a little differently. I become more aware of those things. I make sure I look into the camera and not on the person on the screen, because then I'm not making a connection with them, right? So learning those little techniques. But what are some other things that you have to do differently when you're
I think
online?
That like you're talking about, like getting the energy back. I think you have to work on that, right? You have to find ways to draw people out too. So it kind of goes with that, not just speaking to them, but speaking with them. So creating like breaks and prompts where you ask for feedback, like, hey, how's everyone, like in calling on people and that sort of thing, right? Like, and so that's really like getting people to engage. And there's still like when you're doing it, you can see the energy. Like you can tell like, oh, that person's not paying attention, or they're lost, or they're just like being really quiet. And so it's the same kind of skills as a facilitator going like, hey, I noticed Luke hasn't said anything. So I'm going to call Luke
Luke's
out.
drooping a little bit right now. Luke, would you like to share something?
What are you really asking me? I don't know if we're in example time or if that was a real question.
That was a real question. Yeah. Would you like to share, Luke?
No, I mean, I completely agree with Rachel. I think it's like what maybe you intuitively did as a facilitator in the room, you have to find ways to be more intentional about it online. And so if you were not intentional live, like it's going to be really hard for you to even know what to pay attention to online. And so little things like, I always put my camera over my screen and then I center everyone where I'm like always scanning. I'm scanning everyone the entire time. And just like Rachel said, like not being afraid to say, hey, Hannah, looks like you have a thought. Like, what are you processing right now? And then I'll also agree with what you said about being more animated, not just creating and giving energy, but also in creating space. So, whereas in a room, I might just kind of lean back in my chair and kind of look around, like maybe cock my head a little bit and look around to show, I'm thinking. Other people are probably going to react by, what is he thinking about? Oh, that was an interesting question. I don't know what I think about that. Instead, I might have to like make kind of a thinking face, like I'm really pensive, and I put my hand on my beard and I close my eyes and maybe even look down at my keyboard and nod like, So it becomes this kind of theatrical, like I don't want anyone to have any question about the tone, like what I'm inviting them to, know? So yeah, I completely agree with all those things. And
I think that's kind of the calling out the awkwardness too, right? So at the beginning of a lot of sessions, I would say, if someone says something you agree with, like give a thumbs up. or if you have a question, like physically raise your hand. Like I know there's all those like digital tools, but those don't register for me as a facility, like as you're scanning. Like I don't see someone's hand raised or like the heart pop up. That's, so I'm like, no, give me a physical heart with your hands, or like spirit fingers, like wave your hands or clap, or, like I think there's an advantage and a disadvantage to like Zoom where there's only one audio channel. Right. I think that's good and bad at sometimes. Like you can't sing happy birthday very well, but it's also really nice because it's really hard. It's really clear to interrupt someone. And so people stopped doing that, right? Like people allowed people to speak. So that's like the bonus of that. But I think you're right. Like, you have to become more intentional, and then you have to be really explicit about it. So I would call people out, and a lot of my stuff would be, okay, like how's everyone feeling today? Give me like 1 to 10 on your fingers, or like use your elbow, your arm as like a gauge, and it was all these things that everybody was always uncomfortable with, but you're just like, hey, we're all doing it together. We're all uncomfortable. Like just get over it, and like, because you don't want to be the one person who's not playing the game, right? And most people just kind of went in for it. And then once they relaxed, it was like really easy to get them to do things, like to do that sort of stuff. But it was just kind of like going through, and actually, I mean, Hannah's seen my like run of show for an online thing.
It's impressive.
They're
The detail to which she plans out a live, not scripted, but live event online. Like it's a next level kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's very intentional because it's like, one, you have time can go either really slow or really fast online. And so depending on what you need to do in that time, you want to be really aware of it. And honoring the time that you have with those people, right, is very important. So it's good. I mean, for me, it's like I have these parts, and there's still space for whatever comes up. But it also is like, these are important things that we need to make sure we capture. And also the other thing is you keep moving through. So you don't hit that lull where everyone's like, oh my God, okay, I'm so done. I'm done. I want to get off. It's like, nope, we're on to the next thing. And here's the next exercise. And okay, we're going to shoot you into a breakout room. Here's your prompts. Here's your conversation. Come back. And one of the things that I found online that was really fun, once we kind of like this group of like colleagues of mine, once we kind of realized this, there's this amazing like anonymous intimacy that you can build online. And so people would really share things that they wouldn't share if we were all sitting in a space together, right? Because you could create whatever you shared in that space was all that you shared. They didn't know what else, you weren't going to run into them at the coffee shop, most likely. I mean, this is different if you're talking to an organization where it's like the whole team, but if it's people from all over, people coming in for a workshop or training, they would share and like dive into things that they wouldn't if they knew that they were going to have to see that person in the bathroom, right? Or like 2 days, So that was really fun to be able to play with that and push people into conversations and spaces that they might not have done in person.
Yeah. And, another thing that I found, this to just echo what you're saying, is that the use of vulnerability to elicit vulnerability from participants, like I had to ratchet it up quite a bit. So Hannah, I'm sure you remember this, but like we had started a 15 session training on emotional intelligence in February of 2020.
That's true. I forgot
that was
about the timing of that.
And so we were teaching consultants this consulting firm, they said, hey, we want our differentiator to be that we're courageous, that we ask about the heart of the issue with our clients, that we advocate, that we're not afraid of, conflict, and that we do kind of next level work. And so we're like, awesome, like EQ, like that's the missing link. So we start this program, and then like we had to teach emotional intelligence online to this cohort, and it worked. Like, I mean, it was clunky at first. Like I remember I had 2 computers set up at one point in like the sunroom of my house, like with 2 cameras, and one was pointed at me And then I had another just pointed at our flip chart on the wall.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, guys, you might have to pin the flip chart and then like switch back and forth and pin me if you want to be able to see it. So we're all like figuring out the technology. And, but like it worked. Like we had people share about like really personal things and, you know, stories of trauma and lots of tears. And, you know, it was a real effective program, but it took us like really leaning into it, like for it to work, to do something about emotional intelligence and it be real and vulnerable. Like we had to just like lay it all out there. What is my example going to be today? What story am I going to tell? How far can I push it to be able to invite people to actually get real? And like, that took a lot of work.
Yeah. It takes a lot more planning right on the outside. And I think that was a lesson we learned really early where it was like, oh my gosh, a 1 hour session, we've planned for 3 hours where it was also challenging, right? Where you two, if you're teaching that together, you're not in the same space and you can't like run to the corner and go, holy shit, did that just happen? Like what, we got to change the entire plan, right? Like you can't do that the same way you can in the room. And so you have to build that in too, where it's, let's shoot these people off to a breakout. They have 15 minutes. We regroup and figure out if our plan is still working. And like, what do we need to change? And I mean, so there's a lot on the back end and like the technology is a whole nother
that adds a layer of complication, or it is a tool, and the better you get at using a tool, the easier it gets. And it's second nature. It's like learning how to drive. You have to think a lot about how to drive, and then you learn how to drive, and you don't think about how to drive. You just drive. And it's same thing with, you know, these types of technology tools as well. But there is a learning curve and being aware of that. So what that sparked for me, Rachel, was when you talked about kind of that coordination. You know, Luke and I, we had this conversation earlier today with someone who commented on the fact, you know, Luke and I seem in sync when we do this. And there's this tacit coordination that you learn when you spend time with someone. And we do this, we've been doing this podcast together for 2.5 years. We knew each other in school way back when. And recently we've worked on a lot of the same projects. So we've traveled and been in the same spaces. And so there is some intuitive tacit coordination that you get when you do things in person. The same is true though online, and you learn that. And I remember when I made that shift of you talked about the voice and people were always talking over each other. And then we learn to pick up on the little clues, like when the yellow circle is around the person on Zoom, that means they're talking. Or when we had to learn this with the podcast, right? Because here we can pick up on when somebody wants to say something, you give them space. Online at first, we weren't very good at that, right? And so then intuitively, we started just like picking up on clues, and then we started talking about it and making it more explicit. So like when I unmute my microphone, that is the clue that I want to say something, right? And so paying attention to that and being aware of that and reading both the audience, the clues from the people, and reading the room, the online room, which is just different clues that you have to look for. And also the technology clues, right? That you can use to either nudge or invite.
Well, even like you talking about that with the two of you adapting, right? The learning to say, now I'm going to pass this over to Hannah. Like learning to do that in your facilitation with a team that you've worked with for years seems awkward.
Yeah.
But it's so important to do online because it not only like helps your other facilitator or your teammate know, oh, it's my turn. It also helps everybody else track, because there's this weird delay that happens online, right? And everybody's bandwidth is a different, like, and so you can't unmute and start talking right away, right? You have to unmute, and then you have that like split second before you act like anyone can actually hear you, right? Or you get the, I can't hear, the weird, like, are you unmuted? Like, So you have to learn that cadence too is a little bit different online, and the way and it's funny. I think some people felt really awkward about doing the like, hey, I'm going to pass it over to you now. I'm going to pass the mic over, or hey, Hannah, can you show those slides? Because we don't do that in person. But when you do that online, it just makes everything else easier. Everybody feels good about it. It's just like a release, but it was a learning for most people. And a lot of the work I do was like, I had the same kind of production team, but we had new speakers and guests all the time that we would have to kind of talk through the technology, talk through how it's going to go, show them these huge run of shows that they're like, what is going on?
Yeah,
this
it was
like
overwhelming for me the first time I saw it. I was like, this is way too much planning for me. And then I got into the actual event and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so helpful.
Yeah, but it does. Like if you're not used to that, and it's just a new thing that you have to adapt to. But then once you do, it's just like it releases so much of that stress that we carry, and the trying to be being perfect at all the technology. I mean, we were all in that space where it was like I had a camera over here, and then doing spotlighting people accidentally, or nobody can hear you, or whatever that is. We kind of got through all of it, but there is the learning that comes with it.
Yeah, but I'll say even with learning and being more coordinated and picking up on those clues, it still requires way more planning. And like the level of explicit instructions for breakout groups and for activities, and the level of prep for activities, if you're using Miro or whatever it is, like it is just a whole different world. And I think, we've just been kind of talking facilitator to facilitator here. I don't want to forget about our listeners who, a lot of folks are leaders responsible for leading meetings. It's a part of their job, but it's not their whole job, right? They're not professional facilitators. And so I think, the takeaway that I want listeners to hear is that if you want to have an effective meeting where you have conversation topics, where you want people to respond in the chat, where maybe you're doing like a little fun get to know you activity, even if it's as simple as like, hey, everybody, put a GIF in the chat of, how your week's been so far. The level of planning around that, the level of instructions you need to be ready to paste in there, all of those things, like don't think that you don't need to spend time doing that. Even if it's just like blocking off 10 minutes to make sure that there's not anything that you need to have prepared and want to have prepared, pulling your tab out of your 50 other tabs so that
browser window,
right? So that you've got your 3 tabs that you want to share all in one window so that it's really easy. Like all of those things take some sort of prep work just to do some basic things and have coordination, because when you kill flow, it sucks. Like it's way different than live, where people have something. Okay. Yes. In person. It's way different where people can kind of look around and like, we got new curtains in here. They're only watching you fumble with sharing your screen. Yes. So yeah.
I think I would say my biggest advice is slow down. And take time. And, like technically, like you're saying, pull your slides and do all that stuff. I mean, I do the same thing. I use my notes, or I use a Google Doc, and I put down anything I think I'm going to put in the chat. Like any prompt, any question, any link, any of that stuff. I have it prepped and ready. So it's just a copy and paste. And it's not like, oh, I have to type this and try to keep you entertained and like cut and paste. And so, it's just slowing down and prepping anything that you think you might need for that time. And then also having some backup of like, what happens when your slides go down? Like think of things that you can throw out to be like, here, put this in the chat, what, I mean, it's so easy to throw out things like, what's one word about what you feel right now? What'd you have for lunch? Right. Like things like that. Like, what are you excited about? Like, what are you having for dinner? Or like, that sort of thing. I don't know.
Yeah. Man, Rachel, this has been such a fun and energizing conversation for me. And I know you and I can talk for hours, and we do. So we could continue this conversation, I'm sure, for a long time. But we do want to just, first of all, thank you for coming today and for sharing with our listeners some really practical tips and tools for how you can create connection and community online as we find ourselves doing more and more of the work that we do, not always in person, right? And so it's a skill that can be learned if you pay attention, and you, as a leader, you know, our jobs, a lot of our job is to communicate effectively. And so this is one of those ways that we can learn how to communicate more effectively. So thank you for sharing some professional tips from a pro facilitator of how to lead effectively in online spaces. If people want to connect with you, Rachel, what's a good way to find you and learn more?
I mean, definitely on Instagram, it's Rachel Hicks Design, and that's the same as my website is rachelhicksdesign.com.
Yep.
So probably the best way to connect with me is through either of those.
Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Luke, how can people find out more about our team?
Yeah, purposeandperformancegroup.com. Whether it is in person or online.
Yes.
We would love to help your team grow, develop, help your leaders grow. That's the stuff that we get out of bed to do every day. And so hit us up. We'd love to talk to you. And I will just say, we should have led with this, but all of the organizations right now are like, hey, do we make everyone come back? Hey, and especially
come back to the office.
Come back to the office. Like senior leaders are like, I don't know, the vibe isn't what it should be, and people aren't and like that's a problem that needs to be solved. And creating real belonging and real connection in online spaces is part of the solution.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's all of the solution for every organization, but if every leader could master some of this skill, that angst about, oh gosh, we need to like make everyone come in 3 days a week that people are worrying about right now, I think would be a little bit less.
Yeah.
And so the challenges we're facing now on reopening up, being together again in person, is partly because we didn't quite learn all the lessons we needed to learn, I think, during the last 2 years. So we should have led with that, because I think we solved that, we gave all the solutions on how to do that. But I don't know. That's my takeaway. And if you want to talk to us more about it or talk to Rachel about it, like reach out. I'm sure we would love to talk.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Thank you guys so much. Go make it a great week.
Thanks.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Bratterud and Luke Freeman, and produced by Ben West. Theme music is by Evan Grimm. Title track Fake Love available on Apple Music. And this podcast was recorded at Storycatcher Studio with video and audio editing and production support by Brad O'Hara and Alicia Crum, with inspiration, strategy and technical support by yours truly, Neil Hughes. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and remember, previous episodes are available at magicintheroom.com.